what we're experiencing is what we're experiencing. You know, like how do we develop discernment and discrimination? How do we verify our experience for ourselves to the extent we need or want? And like, how do we do that in community in a way that enables us to move all of humanity into this next phase? That's what we're experiencing. You know, like, how do we? So we're streaming on YouTube. Great, Daniel. Nice.
Let's see if I can move it to Facebook now.
Okay. And you know, so I think the 5 weeks, and we'll get more into the 5 sessions, you know, but we're going to have 2 weeks and then we'll have a guest, and then 2 more weeks. But essentially, you know, we're starting big. You know, the first week is kind of looking at the meta theory of the big and deep history of the galaxy and the ancient Earth. So we're starting in this really big context, and then we kind of bring it down a bit in the second week, looking at alien agendas, the deep state, and the soul, and kind of, you know, what do we know? What are some of the different narratives and frames to make sense of that? Then we have the third week, which is the guest speaker week with Whitley Strieber. So we're very excited to have Whitley joining us. And so that'll be just more like an open Q&A and engagement session with him. Then on the fourth week, we come back to kind of the core content of the course. And this is where we're going to look more at the individual, right? Because the first week is the big galactic ancient Earth history. Then it's kind of the deep state and the history of the UFO cover-up. And then from the fourth week, you know, after talking with Whitley, which feels like a really nice transition because, you know, Whitley's such a powerful writer and speaker and, you know, explorer of these realms. And what does it mean to be in relationship with what he calls the visitors? So then in the fourth week, we really look at our pathways to personal power and cultivating our multidimensional senses. And like, what does it mean to have multidimensional awareness? And then in the last week, talking about, okay, given that, how do we birth the next era of humanity? You know, how do we redefine what it means to be human in this emerging galactic age? What does an exo society look like? You know, as disclosure continues, you know, either through kind of what's happening via TTSA, To the Stars Academy, or the New York Times, you know, and kind of what's happening in that context, or just to the extent that we, the people, create our own disclosure around coming forward with our own experiences, our own understandings, our own encounters. But regardless, you know, basically helping to lift the taboo, normalizing that we live in a multidimensional multiverse that's highly populated with all kinds of intelligences, and that we're in relationship with a phenomenon that defies categories, is participatory, it's responsive to our own awareness, our own consciousness. And so, like, what does that emerging society look like? And what does it look like in the context of all these other big issues that are happening? The emergence of the surveillance state, runaway AI, you know, climate change, you know, all these kind of big, you know, issues that are converging to create, you know, what I would call a meta crisis, and other people have referred to as a meta crisis. And each week, Daniel and I want to be introducing personal practices and examples, sharing our own experience, so that we're constantly throughout the 5 weeks kind of taking the big picture in, but we're also anchoring it in our own empowered capacity to be engaged with our own consciousness, our own awareness, and learning about other practices or even participating in practices that start to give us a taste of or deepen our access to these other realities. So let me stop there and see, you know, how's it going, Daniel? Anything you want to add? Do you need more time?
We're good. I mean, I did what I could at this point, which is I posted a link to it on Facebook on my page, which you could share to your audience. Yeah, I mean, so this is a subject of tremendous fascination to me. My first book, Breaking Open the Head, came out in 2002, and it was on psychedelic shamanism. And I started that book as a sort of skeptic, secular materialist, but suffering a sort of existential crisis where the life in the materialist paradigm seemed totally meaningless, you know, because this idea that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of the brain, that any type of self-spiritual development, any type of, you know, kind of, you know, soul or spirit is total nonsense, you know, that when you die, that's it. And I started to ask myself, how could I interrogate that? Somebody needs to mute, I think. Um, uh, I asked myself how I could interrogate that, and I remembered my psychedelic experiences from college with mushrooms and LSD. And I was a journalist, and then I started exploring, kind of psychedelics as an adult. And I ended up doing an Iboga initiation in West Africa, and visited the Mazatecs in Mexico to work with mushrooms, and visited a indigenous culture called the Sequoia, who are in Ecuador. Use ayahuasca as their sacrament. Also explored a lot of synthetic psychedelics, and I had many kind of paranormal and psychic experiences that it took me a long time to kind of take them seriously in a way, to accept that this is what was happening. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I described in the first book. And I had experiences of kind of like where during a trip with a substance called dipropyltryptamine, my friend and I felt that we were kind of surrounded by these sort of slightly, kind of haughty, somewhat aggressive beings. And one of them kind of felt like it stayed in my head for a while. And then I began to have like poltergeist phenomena. And, it all sounds totally crazy, like mirrors were falling off the walls and so on. But it's also what you discover when you read in a lot of the kind of occult literature. A lot of things that I would have happen to me, I would then, as I studied, Aleister Crowley or Rudolf Steiner or Carl Jung, it all seemed to make sense. And then in shamanic ceremonies, I discovered, that shamans could kind of access information from a transpersonal domain and understand things that hadn't been told to them or shared with them. And there was often the sense of there being kind of other levels or forms of consciousness kind of connected with these experiences, whether ayahuasca kind of manifesting as a feminine presence, or Iboga as a kind of masculine, kind of African presence. So, then in my second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, I started to take seriously kind of the prophetic knowledge traditions, wisdom traditions of these indigenous cultures at the time that we were in, and a lot else that they talk about. And this ended up leading me all sorts of places, but for instance, to the crop circles in England, starting in, I think, 2002. I spent a summer in England exploring the crop circles. And once again, I was totally a skeptic. I thought, they probably were all human made, but as soon as I started researching it, I first wrote an article about it for Wired magazine. I discovered so many anomalous pieces of the puzzle that it just drew me in and magnetized me. And, it over time, and we'll go deeper into this probably in the course, I became fairly convinced that there was an interactivity happening with other levels of consciousness, other galactic levels of intelligence that were in a way kind of playing with us in a trickster-like fashion, but also with a sense of like an underlying benevolence. And very much like psychedelic experience, working with the crop circles was very synchronistic, like all these anomalous synchronistic phenomena would emerge and so on. And then there was a crop circle that appeared, I believe in 2003, that was a direct reply to, it's called the Arecibo response. It was a reply to a message that we'd sent out into space that showed like a little person and our DNA code and, kind of some building blocks of our understanding of reality. This message came back almost exactly, very precisely rendered with a smaller kind of alien being with an extra strand of DNA and other changes. And it seemed to link up with the whole phenomenon of the gray aliens, who are often discussed in abduction accounts, who seem to be the most kind of available kind of non-human sentience that we're able to kind of access, in this way. So I ended up doing a lot of study of that, and felt that the more that I kind of went into it, the more that phenomenon also started to approach me in like a very, very creepy way. So yeah, so as Sean talks about in his Our Wild Cosmos essay, we don't really have a kind of scientific modality or rational or logical modality for understanding what's happening, in these, incredible stories that we're getting from people, and sometimes with some types of evidence, and this kind of interesting facet of the phenomenon that it's just not very responsive to kind of the scientific method, to kind of logical evidence-based approaches. People have seen so many craft, and there's so many descriptions of it, and now we're seeing the military release, some imagery and so on, but there's still nothing like that. We haven't seen like the big kahuna, and it always feels like it retreats a little bit from our efforts to define it or understand it, almost as if it's deliberately interacting with us in a modality that, you could think of as the trickster, the Jungian archetype of the trickster. So yeah, I mean, I'm very intrigued also. For me, a lot of my work has been informed by the occult visionary cosmology of Rudolf Steiner, who had a very, very developed and evolved kind of way of thinking about kind of other worlds, other incarnations of the earth, humanity's evolution on the earth, what it means to develop supersensible perception and supersensible cognition. We talked about higher forms of cognition that we could, gain through our kind of spiritual scientific work, such as intuition, inspiration, and imagination. And he talked about all these kind of types of beings in the supersensible realm that impacted our human world in many different respects, and had always kind of been with us and always been a part of our evolution. So, I mean, as I said, there's a lot to unpack with Steiner, who I find, when you're looking at kind of these visionary occult cosmologies, whether it's different channels or Steiner, whether it's like Bashar or Ashiana Dean, who did the Voyager books, or Stryber. I mean, it's not like one wants to take any of it totally in a literary sense, and there's often a tendency with students and researchers of this phenomenon to quickly kind of like over literalize. Like we see that with somebody like David Icke, who became fixated on this idea that the ruling elite of the planet are actually direct descendants of kind of reptilian aliens who have a particular plot for humanity and so on. We see all these efforts to get a hold of this phenomenon that end up kind of over literalizing it, or bringing it back into a kind of binary and dualistic logic. And by doing that, they somehow violate the subtlety and the complexity of this phenomenon. So what I love about what Sean has done in his work in Our Wild Cosmos, and why I think it's such an incredibly powerful opportunity to build together, is, like we need better taxonomies. We need more phenomenologically precise ways of thinking about the huge range of contact experiences people have in ordinary states of consciousness, non-ordinary states of consciousness. Some are physical and visceral, some are like subtle and astral, and begin to find a path forward to kind of figuring out what this can actually mean for humanity's evolution. If we can evolve our consciousness in a way that we can more consciously and intentionally interact with this phenomena without collapsing into a simplistic binary or duality, or obviously not dismissing it or rejecting it. It feels to me this is a very actually crucial task for humanity at this present time. It's something that seems more and more necessary, particularly when we see the cascading disasters that are happening in the world today. It does sometimes feel that there are other agencies involved in world events. What St. Paul talks about in the Bible as like powers and principalities, like things that are happening that are very, very peculiar. And we can also see how kind of the right wing has been kind of weaponizing kind of occultish conspiracy ideas to kind of push forward a certain kind of agenda and a certain kind of ideology around what's happening on the planet now and what the future looks like. And I feel that unless a sort of counter narrative and a counter mythology is presented in a very clear and coherent way that more and more people can kind of comprehend and understand, it's going to be a very difficult process in the next few years, if that makes any sense. Sean, I'll bounce it back to you. What are some of your thoughts on what I said there?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much resonance. I mean, this is why we're here together, creating a space to have a conversation with others about how to have a conversation about all of this, right? And I think this is such a key point, is because we are embedded in a scientific, materialistic, reductionistic culture, and where the taboo around UFOs and the paranormal is so strong, like we have forgotten how to talk about these things. Like we don't know how to have a sophisticated conversation with useful distinctions, and we don't know how to embrace each other's range of beliefs, but also challenge each other to think more critically and more experientially about this phenomenon and its various manifestations. So I feel like part of what Daniel and I are striving to do and wanting to co-create with all of you is exploring how do we create a more sophisticated conversation around these topics, and in the process provide a counter narrative to the simplistic ways in which the liberal and even conservative currents in society in some ways are hijacking some of this content material for their own views and understandings, which to some extent is fine and understandable. But I feel this phenomena is so nuanced and subtle and complex that we need a more integrative way of being in relationship to it. And one of the things that's really driven me in this process over the last few years is, given my various encounters with different types of intelligences and subtle beings, is wanting to understand how can I talk about the ways in which those beings are real and have an ontological dimension, that they exist, that they're not just in my head, as it were. Like how can we develop our scientific way of thinking that can better incorporate and not reducing those phenomena to a strictly scientific narrative, but what are the ways in which we can up-level a scientific orientation and complement it with experiential and Gnostic and transpersonal modes of non-conceptual knowing? Like how can we weave together a better understanding that takes the best from science? And when you expand science to be a broad empiricism that's informed by the various occult cosmologies and occultists, like Rudolf Steiner is an amazing example of a scientist, a scientist of the subtle worlds and realities. And I think there's a lot that is available to us in this day and age from various lineages and traditions and books, where we can build a much better way of talking about and thinking about these realities and integrating them back into our daily life. My experience of the phenomenon and my study of the phenomenon leads me to really identify at least 4 characteristics that seem to show up across the board. One is energy. Energy seems to always be involved, different kinds of energy, electromagnetic and others. Light, there often is a luminosity and different kinds of light, and which is a form of energy as well, I guess. And intelligence. This phenomena is intelligent, and then with that intelligence comes a responsiveness. And Daniel was just talking about the participatory nature, that like basically when he started looking at this phenomena, it started looking back in creepy ways, and so that we're in dialogue with this. And my sense and study of all this is that there's multiple layers of the phenomenon, that some of it's extraterrestrial, some of it's subtle beings in other dimensions, some of it's extra dimensional, some of it's our own collective psi phenomena that we're manifesting for ourselves. Some of it's an archetypal process of trying to rebalance the hypermasculinity with a more feminine orientation. Like my sense is there's many layers. And what I find frustrating is when I read or listen to people who they find a piece of the truth and then they try and kind of reduce the complexity of the phenomenon to their particular piece of the pie of truth. And so I think part of what Daniel and I want to do is really create space for the complexity of the phenomenon, allowing the phenomena to instruct us and to guide us with how to be in relationship to it in its multifaceted nature, and not making it all ETs or all making it just, psychedelic hyper reality, or making it all archetypal phenomenon. Like it seems to be all of that and more. And sometimes certain encounters might be one or more of those things more so than others. So that's where the discernment comes in. Like, how do we start to parse through all of that? How do we understand the complex ways in which these different layers of the multidimensional multiverse are activated and interacting with us? For me, part of what I bring to this is what I would call a metadisciplinary approach. I'm wanting to understand, like, what does traditional philosophy have to say that could help us in this? The traditional academic disciplines, how can they shine a light on aspects of this phenomenon? What does the UFO literature and the space studies literature have that could help us make more sense of this? And what do the paranormal and esoteric pioneers and literatures have that can help us make sense of this? So I really am far reaching, and Daniel too is, and that's part of why I've been drawn to and appreciated his work. It's just like the way he weaves together so many of these different threads, from science to Jungian studies to, experiential, stuff, to analytic and philosophical. And, so it's like, we really need to engage all those different modes of knowledge acquisition and verification and exploration. And I'm really interested in, like, what's possible when we lift the taboo, right? When we lift the taboo around talking about our paranormal experiences, our encounters with different types of beings, our sightings of UFOs or orbs or strange phenomena in the sky. What becomes possible when we're in a community of practice where we can openly share or listen to people who've had a wide range of experiences, and for whom many of us are still in the process of trying to make sense of those experiences? I mean, one thing that really stands out in the experiencer literature is people will have a 1-minute encounter that they spend the next 30 years trying to make sense of, right? Like, these encounters are soul filled. They're filled with soul. They impact us at a deep soulful level. And so I think a lot of what Daniel and I are wanting to do in this course is create a space for sense making. How do we make sense of all of this, both experientially and in our own life, but also in terms of the larger global trends that we see happening? And what role might we play as activists and as psychonauts to contribute to tipping the scales in a direction of wellness and love and thrivability and transparency, and just creating the world that our heart knows is possible? Because, I think, unfortunately, there does seem to be a lot of unsavory realities that have power and momentum and capacity to influence things, right? Like, it's not a pretty sight out there. There's a lot of dark energies and forces and dynamics, and how we make sense of those. How do we integrate that darkness with the light of some of the other things we're talking about? I mean, Daniel does a great job of this in his essay, The Occult Control System, talking about how we really need to look close and hard at the dark elements of all of this, because on some level, it's our own shadow. And if we don't find a way of being in relationship to these darker currents, talking about them, processing them, working through the ways in which they show up in our own life, I think we're left vulnerable. And, so I think it's part of the integration of the masculine and feminine, the light and the dark, the old world that's emerging, and the new world that's emerging in the old world, and the wisdom of the ancients that we can draw on. So there's a lot of ways to integrate. And, so I think we're interested in how do we do that together with all of you.
Yeah, and maybe that, we get the aliens we deserve.
Right.
I mean, I guess there were a couple of good questions in the comments here. Somebody asked, is there not a role for science in this discussion, particularly with discoveries in quantum mechanics? And I would say absolutely. I mean, quantum mechanics, quantum physics really does seem to mesh with the occult and esoteric and shamanic worldviews, mystical worldviews, to a profound degree. This sort of, it leads to this, possibility that, consciousness is really the underlying reality, and matter, everything, time, space, matter are just kind of expressions, transitory expressions of that consciousness as it explores its, creative capacities, its various, dreams that it's having in a way. So yeah, I mean, that's, and then if we look at something like string theory, which posits that there are, multiple dimensions, like these, hidden dimensions of time and space, well, maybe those are actually populated realms. Maybe there's a whole ecology of different forms of consciousness and different types of sentient beings that exist in these other dimensional realities. I mean, one experience that many people have when they smoke dimethyltryptamine or DMT past a certain threshold is being kind of suddenly this world disappears and they find themselves in a fully immersive kind of hyperdimensional reality where they have the sense that they're surrounded by the presence of kind of much, much further advanced levels of consciousness, kind of with a level of power that dwarfs anything that we've yet understood. And that's obviously a subjective experience that one has, but it's one that's quite profound because you're just in that experience. It's totally kind of realized around you, and it feels like a realm where kind of technology and the organic have almost been superseded and become like a hyper-organic, hyper-technological future reality. And that might be one of these tiny little dimensions of space-time that that the superstring theorists are pointing towards. I mean, of course, generally, mainstream scientists don't love this type of conjecture, but it seems like they're more and more open to it. I mean, on the edge of scientific discourse, it feels that a lot of this is happening more and more. I don't know, Sean, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of science. I mean, my, academic training is in philosophy of science. So I'm very interested in like, what are the paradigms of science and how do they shift and change over time? And how do different eras view certain things as real and other things as not real? And how does that change? And what enables that change? Like, how do different periods in time develop different ontologies of what reality is and isn't? And I'm very, interested in actually, finding ways to kind of rehabilitate what we think of as science, to up-level it to match the phenomenon. Like, I find the research done at Skinwalker Ranch to be really instructive in this sense, because here you have an example of, the Robert Bigelow throwing, all the money he has, at the problem to try and document all this paranormal activity. And at the end of 10 years, they come up with their hands empty, in effect, though everyone basically involved with the project had all kinds of crazy experiences, right? And so to me, it highlights that version of science is inadequate for approaching and understanding this phenomenon. But that doesn't mean there aren't aspects of science that can be up-leveled to be able to say something meaningful about the phenomenon, be it paranormal, ufological, or cryptid, and so forth. And I'm actually working on an essay for a chapter right now on, what would be the main principles of an integrative meta-science of UFOs and the paranormal that could start to be a guideline for how might we research and document and evaluate this phenomenon. And also, I just had a conversation with Alfonso Montori, a guy at California Institute of Integral Studies, colleague of mine. He's wanting to put together an anthology of people who research the multidimensional realities we're talking about, and have almost like a textbook of how might you go about researching these phenomena in a more scientific, or mixed methods way that combines qualitative and quantitative methodologies. And with my, kind of integral theory background, I'm a big fan of what's called integral methodological pluralism, right? How do we use multiple kinds of methodologies to investigate and, in a sense, triangulate the data to verify the reality? Like, if you look at abductions, if you just try and understand the abduction phenomena through a strictly empirical lens, there's not a lot of convincing evidence in the traditional scientific sense. But once you let in other methodologies and look at the issue from a methodological pluralist view, you start to see tons of evidence. You start to see that there really is something going on here. So I think this is interesting, like when we expand our scientific orientation to include multiple kinds of methodologies, each which have their own types of verification and validity, their own way of documenting data and evaluating it, then you can really start to build out a way of talking about this phenomena and its realness in a way that kind of current materialistic science doesn't enable. So, you know, and I think there's a lot to be said about the work that's being done in quantum theory. You know, I love the work of Karen Barad and her notion of interaction. And so when you look at the feminist materialisms that have been articulated now, you know, at UC Santa Cruz and elsewhere, like it's highlighting a much more interesting process cosmology of how phenomena interrelate. And I think those are instructive maps and models for this phenomenon, because this phenomenon is very subtle and dynamic and interactive. And so a lot of the kind of more traditional masculine cosmologies, you know, of billiard balls bumping into each other, don't really take us far enough in making sense of it. We need these more dynamic, process-based, interactive metaphysics. And, you know, we're seeing great scholarship done in those areas, but people aren't yet bringing that work to bear on this topic, right? And so I think that's part of what I and Daniel are wanting to do, is like to pull on interesting work that's being done in other domains and, you know, have it shine a light on this exploration.
Sean, we had a few questions about how this 5-week course would be different than your 52-week immersion. I know we have a lot of people maybe who are already involved in your immersion. I mean, I haven't been part of your immersion, so I don't actually know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm hoping that, you know, we will figure out through our sort of dialogical process, you know, where we have productive tensions and
Yeah.
where two perspectives maybe, you know, kind of overlap and interweave in ways that, you know, opens new spaces. I mean, you know, my orientation in this work comes a lot from, you know, kind of the work I've done in shamanism with indigenous folks, like some study I did with the Kogi and the Arawak people in Colombia, and with the Sequoia in the Amazon, and kind of visiting the Hopi and so on. So I'm, you know, the other ones that I mentioned. So I'm hoping to sort of bring in some of that into this. And yeah, but I think that still remains to be, you know, fully defined. I mean, hopefully, I'm you know, listening to you talk, I'm obviously, you know, super impressed by the depth and range, you know, where you're taking all this. I'm hopeful that, you know, as we go through it, we'll find where our perspectives coalesce, where there's tension, and that'll, you know, even further help to kind of, you know, construct this new field, this emergent field, these emergent possibilities. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, that's the main difference, is that this is an emerging, you know, collaboration between you and I, and kind of your communities, my communities, our backgrounds. I mean, we share a lot, as I mentioned in the beginning, you know, with our focus on sustainability and, you know, helping to create, you know, new movements that are bringing things that are usually on the fringes kind of more center. You know, so I think there's some deep qualities of alignment and commitment. And I'm excited to find the differences and the tensions, because I feel like, to the extent that you and I can model that and make room for that, it helps to create a way for all of us to be with those kinds of differences and tensions, because I think we just need to learn how to be in conversation around these complex topics in new ways, you know. And so I'm hopeful and excited about, you know, Daniel and I both surfacing our similarities and our differences, and in a way that inspires and supports all of us in learning how to talk about these things. You know, in some ways, this 5-week course is kind of a taster for, you know, what, you know, I'm doing in the larger course. And, you know, and I'm curious to see what other emergent realities come in this 5-week thing that are just not possible in the other program. So we'll have to, you know, keep sensing into that and seeing kind of what are the similarities and differences.
Should we maybe go through the sort of 4-week syllabus and
Yeah.
talk about those in turn?
Yeah.
I can read off what we have here. Meta theory is galactic and ancient Earth history. It's the first one. We're in a time when humanity is greatly redefining itself. We discover our place, if not yet our role in the macrocosm. We live in a vast universe with at least 200 billion galaxies in it. Our Milky Way galaxy contains an estimated 40 billion Earth-like planets. While we try to settle Mars in the coming decades, we're currently on the verge of confirming simple forms of life on several moons of Saturn and Jupiter. At the same time, through inner exploration with meditation and psychedelics, we are discovering the reality of subtle dimensions, hidden regions of space and time, containing forms of consciousness and intelligence utterly unlike our own. Yeah, I mean, there's already a lot to unpack in that paragraph, which we can get into. According to many researchers, and I guess evidence from some ancient cultures, various kinds of extraterrestrial and interdimensional beings have been interacting with humanity for millennia, playing a role in the numerous ancient sites and megalithic structures we find around the globe. How can we apply evidence and our reasoning faculties to attain a deeper understanding of these influences and interventions? What do they portend for our future? This session will expand your consciousness and touch your heart as we explore what it means to be human within a vast ecology of consciousness, which you are just now beginning to perceive. Yeah, I'm curious, I guess, what's your perspective on this kind of rush to settle Mars, which is being led by these kind of, billionaires who, seem to have this agenda, which is almost kind of like, maybe it's too late for the Earth, we have to move on,
Yeah, it's both, I think, exciting because it's expanding our sense of what it means to be human. And I think, it's similar to when we got the picture from the moon looking back at the Earth, and that really changed our consciousness as a species. I think there's a similar process occurring in relationship to, going to Mars and landing on Mars. On the flip side, I also think it's just more of the same. It's like this heroic masculine desire to like colonize new lands. And so I think there's some danger and issues with kind of the narratives and how that's being, approached. So I think it's a curious and exciting thing that's happening. And so it feels like there's a lot to be explored as to kind of what does it mean and what does it, kind of signal in terms of our evolution culturally.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely questioned this whole singularity, transhumanist kind of approach to where our future is heading. And, it feels in a way that we're seeing, like when we look at the anti-vaccine movement and we look at QAnon and so on, there's a kind of intrinsic, let's say, intuitive rebellion happening against a lot of the sort of principles of technocracy, which which have tended to see, the future of human development in a very unidirectional way, towards more material progress, towards bigger cities, self-driving cars. And I think, the endless development of more vaccines and so on, I think people are beginning to intuitively question this whole path of development. To me, it is connected to the alien question. I mean, a big issue, I know probably many of you, and I know Sean also is very interested in Richard Dolan's work, and this idea that somehow the technological acceleration has maybe been somehow aided and abetted by certain types of extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional contacts. I don't know, Sean, what's your perspective on Richard Dolan's, what he writes about in the UFOs, the national security state, where he's so convinced that there's been this long-running secret program, that actually has ended up creating this kind of shadow government.
Yeah, I think we have to really take that seriously. I think, Richard's done his homework, and I think it presents a really solid case for what he's presenting. And as with so many of these topics, I think there's a lot of other layers as well. So he is specialized in kind of putting together a really comprehensive history and narrative of the way the government has interfaced with the UFO phenomenon and how that has contributed to the national security state and how it's likely led to breakaway group or civilization You know, and so in that sense, it's like we might already be on Mars. You know, if you look at the narratives around the secret space programs, you know, like it's an interesting consideration. Like, do parts of humanity already have off-world vehicle capacities? And, you know, either through the private, you know, aerospace industry and Skunk Works and all of that, you know, Lockheed Martin, or through, you know, some kind of breakaway group. And then so
you have very extreme people like Andre Basangio, right? Like, Corey Good,
yeah,
who have made these kind of, I mean, I almost wonder if some of these claimants are in their own way, kind of disinformation agents. Right. There was a book that I read years ago, which talked about how the CIA was actually testing people's capacity to hook into kind of extreme and weird belief systems, like through the New
Right.
Age subculture.
Right.
And I sometimes, and then we find ourselves on the other hand in this weird period where kind of fact-based reasoning, evidence-based logic is being really, really challenged and kind of taken apart. And even, quite intelligent and advanced people, now do not trust like any traditional or establishment media narrative. Right. It's like we're losing our grounding. And I wonder if this isn't I struggle a lot with the question of whether humanity is heading towards kind of near-term extinction, or if there's some kind of evolutionary impetus that's happening. The kind of evolutionary impetus idea we find in thinkers like Teilhard de Chardin and Jose Arguelles, who were very important for me in my earlier work when I wrote 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And this idea that, there was the organic biosphere, which was the realm of organic life on Earth and all of its incredible facets. Then humanity over the last centuries has been developing the technosphere, this kind of artificial layer, this bridging layer of technology around the planet, which has meshed us together in a sense into one global civilization, into one seemingly, the potential of becoming one global brain. And Chardin, Arguelles, and Vernadsky was another one I think who talked about this idea that the evolution would be towards something called the noosphere. Nous is the Greek word for mind, and this idea was that the technosphere was going to lead us to a kind of unified field of human consciousness in a kind of symbiotic relationship with the Earth as a whole system, in a positive sense. And I've always found that to be a very, very beautiful concept. But we seem to be seeing right now with this kind of authoritarian and fascistic global movement, sort of counter movement that's happening, really does suggest kind of the opposite, that we're moving into something, very dark and destructive that we may not survive as a species. And then trying to figure out, if as part of, whichever evolutionary trajectory, on what part do kind of these sentiences that people come into contact with that seem to have influenced the great religions, that seem to have influenced great monuments of the past, what role are they playing, in our evolutionary trajectory? How do we sort that out? How do we explore that? Whether it's this idea that the sort of direction of Christianity, from a Gnostic perspective, was inspired by kind of off-planet entities called the archons, who are leading humanity into a certain type of delusionary trap. Whether technology itself has a type of incipient self-awareness and consciousness that's trying to. Uh-oh. Massimo, can you mute yourself, please? Yeah. So, that's something that John Lilly, the brilliant scientist and psychedelic researcher, explored. He did a lot of work with communicating with dolphins and whales. Then he was doing a lot of work with LSD and ketamine in isolation tanks. And over time, he kind of developed I guess it's sort of his own profound occult cosmology, where he believed that around the universe there were highly evolved cetacean species that were kind of like an enlightened form of consciousness compared to human consciousness. And they had different planets, they were kind of oceanic planets. And then you would have, more like ape-like species like ourselves who are trapped in these kind of alpha male dominator hierarchies, who reach a certain point in our evolution where we grab on the technology and we begin to move with the technology, but we haven't dealt with our kind of dominance strategies, the potential for sociopaths to succeed and steal systems. And that ultimately leads to this kind of silicon-based consciousness, this artificial consciousness being able to emerge and kind of take over a whole situation, a whole planet. So I don't know. So I dance a lot with these ideas, whether there's still this potential for a positive evolution into a kind of noospheric reality for humanity, or whether we are on the cusp of kind of mishandling our technology to bring about our own extinction. And in either case, I see that there is the potentially the presence of maybe there are different sets of beings that are interacting with humanity, leading us in these different directions. And that's very much what somebody like Steiner, kind of believed and talked about.
Yeah, and I noticed in the chat, the whole topic and issue of like various timelines, is an interesting thing that these different possibilities might be playing out concurrently, right? Where there is some way in which we are on a destructive path, and then another timeline where something more positive and generative is emerging as well. And so, how do we square with that? And I think so many of these issues are complicated by the post-truth era that we find ourselves in. Like it's interesting to me that we're seeing more kind of authentic UFO disclosure from the US government, the Navy, the Pentagon than we have for a long, long time. But it's also occurring in an era when truth just isn't what it used to be, and it's like you could have ET land on the White House lawn and we could have 5G, quality, video of it, and people would still think it was doctored and fake. Right. Even if we had lots of witnesses, so it's kind of like, what's it going to take, like what passes as truth. And so it kind of comes back to each of us, like, how do we sort through all these different claims and make sense of it for ourselves? What's our own sense-making process? Like if you think of something like we were just talking about with like Richard Dolan's take on a breakaway civilization versus Corey Goode and David Wilcock's take on a breakaway civilization, for the average modern, either claim seems crazy and totally, out of sorts. But then, for us, like we might see that, Dolan has a much more conservative view of a breakaway civilization than Goode and Wilcock, and so what does that mean? Like, does it mean that we do have a capacity in some parts of our civilization to fly off planet with advanced tech? But maybe we don't have the capacity to age regress people by 20 years, so it's kind of like, where do these claims, seem crazy and when do they seem plausible, and how do we arrive at that? Like how can we discern between the potential validity of Dolan's view of things versus Corey Goode's view of things? And how do we anchor that in our own Gnostic capacity for knowing, right?
Awesome.
And
I'm going to go and read the second course description.
Yep. Great.
And somebody has got to mute themselves.
Yeah, I just got it.
It's one of the annoying facets of Zoom. Alien agendas, the deep state, and the soul. There has never been a more amazing time to follow UFO disclosure. Since the New York Times broke the story of the Pentagon's secret UFO program in December 2017, a series of historic revelations have illuminated the reality of UFOs and their off-world cosmonauts for the mainstream. The implications of this very tricky, or perhaps trickster phenomena are staggering. It poses a deep challenge to the modern secular worldview, as well as our received religious beliefs. The very foundations of mainstream culture and global society will need to be reconstituted in the face of these new revelations. As we explore the secret history of UFOs, the national security state, in this week's session, we also recall Carl Jung's thesis in his last book, that the flying saucer myth gives expression to an archetypal process within the human psyche. Jung called it the coming of the self into conscious realization. Traditional societies like the Kogi in Colombia remind us that what we experience as our outer reality is a direct expression of our level of consciousness and inner spiritual development. In other words, these extraordinary, seemingly unbelievable discoveries, now shaking the foundation of our postmodern world, are, in important ways, psychic events that occur within each one of us. We offer techniques to help you anchor a deep realization of the nature of consciousness itself, with the perspective that ET disclosure represents a process happening not just out there, but within your psychic and phenomenological reality. What does it mean for you to embrace the reality that mind and matter, consciousness and cosmos are inextricably linked in ways that you and all of us are only beginning to realize? Sean, any thoughts?
Yeah, what I love about, that week's session is, alien agendas, the deep state, and the soul. It's like you don't normally think of those things kind of lined up together. And I think what's important is that we have this tendency to externalize, like, we're victims of, like, the deep state's doing this, or these aliens have these agendas. And while I think all of that is true, I think those are external realities that are influencing what's happening. I also feel that they're reflections of our own consciousness, and that we have to look inward as much as we're looking outward. And it's not to reduce the outward to the inward or reduce the inward to the outward, but I think we need to be in deep dialogue with both and understand the complex ways in which the two are co-implicated with one another, right? And so how do we understand the soul and the soul's unfolding in the context of things that might seem much more external, like the deep state and various, alien agendas, be they, good or bad. So I think in this week, after the first week where we kind of get the big picture, the big map of the galaxies and the realities and just the bigness of history, then this kind of brings it home and looks at what's the relationship between me individually at a soul level and kind of what's unfolding in this current moment that is happening on this planet, which is a very interesting, dynamic, exciting, and terrifying set of realities, right? So I think this kind of question of, the internal and the external and how they're co-implicated is really important, because it's, Jung's notion of synchronicity plays into this. Like, I think there's the relationship between mind and matter, in this sense, between interior and exterior, is much more dynamic than we often realize. And this is what so much of the magical arts are based on, right? Ritual magic and different kinds of magical practices recognize the way in which the intention, concentration, what's inside, symbols, meaning, all of that plays a causal, efficacious role in influencing the world around us. So I think part of becoming empowered activists in this is better understanding the ways in which this inside and outside is in a dynamic, dance with itself.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that, what I just read, I'm certainly very interested in Jungian ideas, both around the flying saucer myth as a kind of image of the the soul, in a way, the higher self, the integration of the self, and also his thoughts around the notion of apocalypse. Even in his time, in the 40s and 50s, he believed that the apocalypse as an archetype in the collective psyche was really on the verge of activating itself in our human reality. And the apocalypse is a term that actually means unveiling, revealing, the unveiling of the hidden thing, a time when everything becomes transparently known and understood. Now we're seeing this idea of the apocalypse is very, very active in the Christian fundamentalist kind of supporters of Trump, who are actually trying to, in a certain sense, accelerate the apocalyptic timeline. So, because for them it brings about ascension, revelation, the heaven, and so on. So in a way, I think they've over literalized this archetype, and they are living it out in a destructive way. And yet at the same time, it may be something that is kind of coming to presence out of necessity in our human world. And when we see what's happening with the ecological breakdowns around the planet, and this probably weaponized virus that has caused chaos around the world. But I love that for Jung, the apocalypse is actually has a positive function and a positive meaning, as it represents what he says the coming of the self into conscious realization, and the self is the total thing that we contain, which is all of the shadow elements and all of the light elements, and you can't just embrace the light without integrating the shadow. So a lot of people are trying to claim they're the light workers or light beings, or whatever, but that huge shadow is being magnified around our planet right now. So yeah, in terms of practices, I think some of the things that we will explore will be integrating the shadow. How do you recognize your own shadow? How do you stalk your shadow? Because if you want to explore kind of multidimensional levels of awareness, you have to have a very big, very good grasp and understanding of your shadow. Even recognizing the shadow is very subtle and is always going to find another place to hide, or to escape your glance. In my own life, I've definitely had really destructive eruptions of shadow material, which have given me a lot to contemplate and work on. In some ways, also gives me insight into maybe the darker forces at work in the world. But I think there is a tendency in the sort of post-New Age spiritual culture to create dualistic binaries, good and evil, dark and light, to say that one is on the side of the light, and that's all well and good, but without a very precise attentiveness and kind of a methodology around addressing the shadow, I'm not sure it works very well.
Yeah, there's, one of the traditions, Hermetic traditions that I've worked within, Franz Barden's work in particular, like early on in the training as a magician in that system, you have to create what's called like a black mirror, which is you have to do this very rigorous, self-honest inventory of all of your shadow and all of your kind of blind spots as best you can identify in all these different kind of aspects that we would label shadow. And the thinking is because as a magician, as you start working in the super sensible realms with, and working with other magicians or other types of intelligences, they're going to be able to sense out those aspects of you and use them against you. And so you have to really do your own homework around your own shadow, and you have to be kind of one step in front of those dynamics and those realities and protect yourself and clean up some of that or tend to it. So it's interesting that even in some of the occult, Hermetic traditions, it's recognized that you really have to do your shadow work before you're like playing in these spheres, right? And so I think there's a similar way in which we need to, learn from that and do our version of that, because I think the ways in which we're very easily fall into these binaries of all good, all bad, which is a form of psychological splitting, and it's not helpful at this point. And actually, by holding more complexity and recognizing ourselves as both complex mixtures of good and bad, dark and light, then I think there's a kind of self-honesty with ourselves and with others that can actually enable new possibilities of healing, new possibilities of perception and experience. And so I think this really is a foundational place that Daniel and I want to focus on. Like, how do we do that for ourselves and support each other in that process?
Let me go and read the next piece of it here. Then we're going to have on the third week, we'll have Whitley Strieber, maybe another guest or two. And then after that, we discussed pathways to personal power, your initiation into multidimensional awareness. As we understand that whatever is happening out there is also essentially happening in here, we begin to prepare ourselves to make the great leap into a new state of conscious realization. Our goal is to learn how to work benevolently and empathically with the new influxes of cosmic energy entering our earthly reality in this amazing epoch. At times, you may feel disempowered and even depressed by the ongoing ecological and political news. When you shift your perspective, however, you discover that you have called this exact circumstance into being to bring about your once in a vast incarnational cycle opportunity for initiation and self-transformation. Great visionaries, mystics, and shamans of the past and present ages have left behind valuable maps and models to help you commune with non-human intelligences, which can be elemental, galactic, daimonic, or celestial. As you learn to connect with these multidimensional realities, you attain citizenship in the emerging exo-society, a new cultural movement destined to redefine our potential as a species. Yeah, I mean, this is, something that I understand from Steiner, Rudolf Steiner, who basically says that your ability to evolve your capacities for supersensible perception and cognition in a healthy way are totally based on your ethical development as a person. They're inseparable. And similarly, the Kogi and the Arawak people who I did some retreats with many years ago, really like the thrust of them, the main thing they wanted to explain to us and why they walked like 25 hours down into the mountains to be with us is to understand that what we are experiencing as the seeming material reality around us is actually a direct expression of our level of spirituality and consciousness development. Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, very, very fascinating right now when we see these kind of almost like character expressions of human horror, that are being reflected back at us with these shootings across the US, this turbulence, this incoherence. When we look at all this stuff that's happening, we also have to ask ourselves, why is that, within me, or how is that within me, or how do I, reach a point where I'm somehow not part of this, field of consciousness that's creating, these types of events in the world. Yeah.
And, another layer to this is, I think there's a lot of ways for us to activate our multidimensional awareness. If you look at the Yoga Sutras, you look at the occult literature, you look at the out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, the psychedelic literature, like look at all the different kinds of contact modalities that open up our awareness, our embodied experience to these other layers of realities, these other dimensions, these other beings that, according to my research and counting, there's at least 50 major different types of faculties or senses that human beings can cultivate. There's like 25 to 30 just in the Yoga Sutras, right? And so there's a wide range of capacity that we have individually that's determined by all kinds of factors. And so it's not necessarily to say that all of us have equal access to all of those possibilities, but it is to say that we all have multiple ways in which we can activate our multidimensional awareness. Some of them take years of intense training, some of which just take an hour of open engagement, right? So there's a wide range of possibility in terms of, being able to work with different practices that can immediately start to shift and open your embodied experience to contact with these other layers, these other realities. And then some of them, are a lifelong, work of practice and engagement, right? So we'll be exploring and highlighting kind of that full landscape of practices that you can become aware of. And some of you are already working on, and you can share your own practices and what that's looked like and how that's worked, so that everyone can kind of, wherever you're at in that journey, you can kind of take your own individual access, to multidimensional realities to the next level, whatever that next level is for you, and be empowered in the process.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question also if there is a sense of there being kind of like this being a different period where there are different maybe energies coming into our world. I mean, I studied the prophecies of cultures like the Aztecs and the Maya and the Hopi a lot. And there were some ideas around, kind of the, why this time was so prophetically important, had to do with sort of like, maybe like cosmic rays, like us passing through fields of, accelerating, fields where the cosmic influences were affecting us deeply. But also, however you want to language it, it's not that easy to language. I mean, there's this guy, Sergio Magana, who's a Nahuatl lineage holder, who wrote a book called The Dawn of the Sixth Sun. And the Nahuatl or the Aztec shamanic practice has a lot to do with dreaming, lucid dreaming, becoming a warrior, in the dream world. And according to their prophetic understanding, the last 5,100 years that we've just sort of exited around 2012 were a sun of light. And that means that it was a time when material reality, logic, science, manipulation of technology, those became kind of the dominant aspects of a sun of light, period called the sun of light. And now between 2012 and 2021, we're actually in the transition from a sun of light to a sun of darkness. And for the Nahuatl and for Magana, a sun of darkness is a time when there's kind of a shift from daylight, waking consciousness, to reality becoming more like a dream world, more like a waking dream, more psychically available, more psychically malleable. And this to me is a very powerful, and once again, it's not like, I don't recommend when you look at occult cosmologies, whether it's Aztec or Steiner or Gurdjieff or whoever else, taking them as a literal, like, but I think they're very helpful kind of on an intuitive and poetic level to give us some kind of guidance around, what I think we're also, many of us are intuitively feeling. I mean, with the collapse of traditional narratives and establishment media and evidence-based science, with fake news and deep fakes, with the Trumpian era, with this, march of kind of conspiracy-based fascism, it does feel like we're moving more into a kind of surreal reality, like a sort of dream world. And it is fascinating to me that this seems to be prophesied by these ancient indigenous cultures, like the Aztec. But that once again suggests that the onus is on us if we want to, shift the nightmare to a dream. We have to somehow find the way to work on ourselves internally to be able to walk between these worlds and recognize that it is this time of transformation or transmutation. And in a sense, even if we are approaching potentially the end of our continuity physically as a species on the Earth, if we take seriously these other dimensions of consciousness and other potentials within consciousness, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the end of everything. It could be that this is a staging ground or preparation for some evolutionary next stage of development. Once again, I'm not saying that I know for certain or that anybody does, and I mean this in a very different way than, let's say, fundamental Christians might. But I do think there's many things coming to a head at this time, and we have to at least entertain various possibilities. In my heart, I hope that what we see as a emergence of a global civil society movement, which is able to address the destruction of the Amazon, the acidification of the oceans, that's able to reverse these incredibly destructive processes that humanity has put into motion. And that also may require kind of magical acts or, kind of, more of us understanding that as consciousness itself, we have the capacity to kind of influence reality on a deeper level than we've ever imagined. I mean, ironically, I think one of the greatest, magicians on the earth right now is probably Trump. I mean, Trump actually grew up in the kind of religious sphere of Norman Vincent Peale, who was the kind of American occultist who wrote the book, The Power of Positive Thinking. And essentially, the power of positive thinking is a very kind of rudimentary occult philosophy, which is that if you want to accomplish things, you train your thoughts so that you don't allow any negative thoughts in. You have no restrictions on your thought. It's just like you have a goal and you move towards it. So Trump, apparently wouldn't listen to much, but he would listen raptly and attentively to Norman Vincent Peale for many hours, and he was able to integrate the power of positive thinking. So whenever he was talking about becoming president, he said, "Well, if I ever run for president, I'm going to win." There was never any doubt, and it's just a fascinating study, of kind of the power of a certain kind of rudimentary occult thinking when it's taken to this type of extreme. I don't know, Sean, what's your perspective on that?
No, it's a powerful lens. And, I think there's been some great analysis of kind of around chaos magic and, Gordon White's work and Trump and the internet. And so I think it's helpful to think of these realities in the context of those hermetic and occult dynamics, right? And I think, it's worthwhile, like, can I stretch into making sense of some of what we're seeing through those frameworks for sure. And the other thing that I really loved about what you're saying and pointing to is kind of the evolutionary emergent. I mean, I mentioned, the 25 to 30 kind of cities or magical powers that the Yoga Sutras document that people can cultivate, and many traditions have their similar list. Those are capacities that humans have and can develop that have been available to us, for millennia, but there are also new emergent capacities that are possible that have never been experienced or embodied. Like I'm thinking, for instance, of the work of William Mistel, who works with elementals, and he talks about new types of love that are now available on this planet as a result of certain types of elementals, experiences of love that have never been experienced by a human being. And so I find this really fascinating that, there are new kinds of experiences, new types of realization. H. Almas also talks about this in his book, Runaway Realization, that yes, there are the different types of realization experiences that the different traditions have documented and different paths can cultivate. But there's also new emergent kinds of embodied awareness and knowing and understanding and perception that either have never been experienced or have just been experienced in very, brief moments. But so all of that's to say is like our own embodiment and access to multidimensional realities is not necessarily a static or foregone conclusion. Like there are all kinds of new evolutionary ways in which all of this is manifesting, both those realities and our embodiment, and then the intersection between the two. So I think this is a really fascinating, area to kind of consider and lean into and explore together. You think of Michael Murphy's book, The Future of the Body, which was 30 years ago, that it was written of like kind of these new emergent ways, like what is the future of our bodies and our capacities, as we begin to interface more and more with these realities. And because this phenomenon is so responsive and participatory, something new starts to emerge the more we interface with it, the more we engage in it. And so I think as a society, that's going to be an interesting factor to consider, like how that shifts over time, because you think of just the ways in which like psi phenomena, skeptics do the same experiments and they don't get the results, but someone who believes or is open to the phenomena gets good results. And so it's not that the results are false with the believer and true with the skeptic. It's kind of like both sets of results are probably real and true, but there's a way in which the consciousness of the experimenter is participating in the outcome in some way. So similarly, I think there's a way in which we can evolve and develop our own embodied experiences in new ways that have yet to be anchored in this realm. So I think this is a big part of the exploration.
I'm going to read the last section, and then maybe I'll have a little more chatting, and then we'll stop for today. If anybody has specific questions that we can answer in the last little time frame, please throw them down. You may have thrown them down earlier, but I may have missed them, so throw them down again if you want. The last week, we're going to talk about exosociety, the power of intention in embodying the next age. Fasten your seatbelts. The next decade will contain more change in human society globally than that of the last 100 years. While we will see devastating impacts of ecological change and asymmetric military conflicts, we also find ourselves on the brink of initiating a new exosociety, where extraterrestrial and extra-dimensional beings and realities are acknowledged and explored with disciplined focus. The wound is the gift. The danger is our opportunity. What techniques can you use to continually hone your intention and awareness? As you anchor this new understanding, what role can you play in ushering in this new orientation in a way that serves regenerative systems and contributes to planetary flourishing? And what are our next steps? Yeah, I guess, one thing I would say is that, what we need to do is, one thing that it feels to me that we need to do more and more of is kind of graduate from binary thinking to thinking that is able to kind of rest in paradox and not be so frightened of the paradoxical mystery, which may be at the heart of being itself, which could actually be something that logic and language can never really interpret or understand properly. When I was researching the crop circles a number of years ago, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, is this pattern real, quote unquote real? Was it made by some non-human intelligence? Was it made by human hoaxers? And I had a lot of friends who were very, very deep students of the sacred geometries of the patterns and, everything about them. And one friend of mine wrote a whole book about this pattern, a very complex pattern that used kind of DNA coding and numerology and so on. And he was convinced that it was not made by people, but then he was sent like some photos that seemed to suggest that it was actually just a hoax, and he was kind of crestfallen. But then other evidence turned up that suggested it couldn't have been made by those people in the way they said they made it. And this seemed to be intrinsic to studying this phenomenon, that you would never actually be able to, separate cause and effect finally. And, Nietzsche was a philosopher who talked about this idea that, cause and effect might ultimately just be something created by the human mind. It's not something that necessarily exists in itself or in reality. But we can only imagine ourselves in a cause and effect. What if the effect precedes the cause? It's a very fascinating idea. I mean, when I was trying to fathom this question of the reality or fakeness of the crop circles as a whole or any individual crop circle, I couldn't sleep at night. I was like, all the time, like just trying to understand, looking at all these different evidence around it. And I'll attach some of the writing I've done on crop circles as part of the course. That ultimately, one night, it was like I just sort of had a snap. And it was very much like, I believe what they talk about in Zen, when you're given these koans, like the sound of one hand clapping and so on, and you have to just keep honing in on it and focusing on it until finally your mind is able to kind of go beyond logic and accept irrefutable oppositions or contradictory positions or paradox as a whole. And that it may actually be that the whole structure of reality is based on paradox in a way. So then we need to think about the future of our cognitive approach as also being one that incorporates uncertainty and paradox on a much deeper level. I don't know if that resonates with you, Sean.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for me, I think this is where the rubber hits the road. Like, this is what I think keeps me coming back to this domain and the various topics that we're going to be exploring together. I often refer to it as doubleness, or it could be tripleness, but it's the ways in which the phenomenon actually manifests two or more contradictory qualities at the same time, right? It's, it's inside, it's outside, it's up, it's down, it's, it's day, it's night, it's, so there's a way in which, and I think your framing of it as a koan is right on, because for me, part of why I'm drawn to ongoing engagement and inquiry around this is because it doesn't fit into any categories, and it defies that by its very nature. And thus it keeps inviting in me a more integrative way of being, a more integrative way of thinking and feeling and sensing, because I'm not afforded the simple categories that I would like to be able to put everything into. Is this real? Is this not real? Is this a hoax? Is this authentic? It's like, yes, it's all of that in some weird, mysterious way. It's all mixed together. And as a result, it invites me to be in relationship to the phenomenon in a very different way. Like if I can just for a moment suspend my tendency to categorize in the binary ways that we've all been kind of educated and trained, and I'm just kind of like in my own very being in relationship to the very being of the phenomenon, kind of pre-category of real, fake, hoax, authentic, and it's just kind of like, that's a certain kind of contact. And I think that's a certain kind of communion that Whitley talks about. There's a certain kind of evolution, energy of the soul that's involved here. And so I'm very interested in us being in inquiry together around what is that? How do we be in relationship to that, that doubleness, and how do we leverage it on behalf of our own evolution and development, to become people who can hold more complexity, not just mental complexity, but emotional, archetypal, psychological, existential, scientific complexity. And I think the other thing about this final week that you just read the description of is, in this year alone, 2020, there have been, by my count, at least 15 historical moments in the history of UFOs, right? And that ranges from, the most recent article from the New York Times, even though it appeared on page 17, arguing from three sources that the US government has crash retrievals, UFOs, off-road vehicles not made on this earth. I mean, that is earth-shattering that the New York Times would, publish that. And so there's been a lot of things that have happened in the last year. But if you even look back to 2017 with the first article in the New York Times, by my count, there's over 50 notable historic moments that have occurred just in the field of UFOs. So there's a lot happening in society already. And part of what's interesting, it's hard to track, all of those things, those 15 items. For those interested, you can go to exostudies.org, and there's a timeline, dates tab that lists them all. But my point is that there's so many other things happening with the election and with the pandemic, and with, that it's like, it's hard to keep all these things front and center. Like there's so much happening. So how do we track it and stay in relationship to it and kind of see all the things that are occurring? So I think that's one of the challenges of the emerging exo society, when we have so many major kind of crises happening across so many categories: climate change and biological warfare and political polarization and UFO disclosure. Is kind of like, how do you navigate all that complexity? I think that's an interesting question for us to consider.
Yeah, great, guys. Well, listen, maybe we will fold our tents up for today. I think that was a plenty, a good intro overview for the moment. Oh, somebody, Linda White, wanted to write about the specific crop circle, the cover of my book. Well, it was a long way away back then. Well, it was a pattern that actually appeared near Stonehenge. There it is. And was one that was actually quite verified as being non-human made, and that people crossed the field in the middle of the day, then crossed it again a few hours later, and this gigantic, enormous, Mandelbrot set fractal had appeared, in the formation. And generally, kind of the fractal nature of reality, the fractal nature of time. The Mayan calendar is kind of like a synchronic, symphonic kind of fractal way of being in time and harmonizing with time. These are all themes from the book, and that particular crop circle just seemed to hold a lot of energy and a lot of meaning. But yeah, I think that we're good for today. Friday, we'll do another live session with Jamie, and Jamie Wheel, the co-author of Stealing Fire. And then September 15th, we're going fast and furious, and we're gonna dig through this other dimensional material, and we hope you join us. Sean, any last words?
Yeah, no, just today's the last day for the early bird, and Daniel put that info, the link and the code in the chat there. So it's also available in other spots, but so grab that if you're wanting to sign up today and have the benefit of the reduced price. But yeah, it's going to be a deep and wide dive, fast and furious, and covering a lot of realities. So hope you join us. I think it's going to be, a multi-dimensional experience, to say the least. So excited to be collaborating with Daniel and all of you, and looking forward to what emerges.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, guys. And feel free to message with questions or concerns.
Great.
Well then, yeah, thanks so much, and we'll talk soon.
Right. Bye, everyone.